My wife served me divorce papers at my own retirement party while my adult children cheered and whistled from the front row. I did not scream or flip the table. I calmly clicked my pen signed. The documents leaned into her ear and whispered, "You have no idea what you just did." By the time her lawyer tried to freeze my bank accounts, the next morning he made a terrifying discovery. There was absolutely nothing left to freeze. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their lives, let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to walk away from people who took your sacrifices for granted. My name is Douglas Barrett. I am 63 years old, and for the last 4 decades, I functioned as a human ATM for a family that despised me. I spent my entire career in the logistics industry climbing the corporate ladder and enduring grueling 80-hour weeks so my wife Patricia could maintain her country club membership and our kids could attend out-of-state private universities. We lived in a sprawling 5-bedroom house in a wealthy suburb of Chicago. To the neighbors, we were the American dream realized. To me, the house was a financial black hole. I thought retirement would be the finish line, a time to finally step off the treadmill, travel a bit, and enjoy the wealth I had quietly accumulated. I had spent 15 years secretly turning a failing logistics firm into a highly profitable enterprise. I was the majority shareholder, a fact I kept hidden from Patricia to prevent her from doubling her already reckless spending habits. She thought I was just a mid-level executive collecting a standard pension. I wanted to surprise her with the truth once I stepped down. She decided to surprise me first. The retirement party was held at a mid-tier banquet hall Patricia had booked. She complained about the cost for weeks, opting for the cheapest catering package available. I stood near the back of the room holding a flimsy plastic cup filled with lukewarm, cheap champagne. 50 guests milled around. Colleagues I had known for 20 years, neighbors we invited out of obligation, and my family. Patricia clinked a spoon against her glass, stepping up to the microphone at the center of the room. The chatter died down. I smiled, preparing myself for the standard obligatory toast about hard work and the golden years ahead. Instead, she reached under the podium and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She walked straight toward me, her heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floor. The silence in the room grew heavy. She shoved the envelope into my chest. I opened the flap and slid the documents out. The bold black letters at the top of the page read, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage." I looked up, processing the paper in my hands. Patricia grabbed the microphone again. Her voice amplified, echoing off the high ceilings. "I am done," she announced, her voice dripping with venom and rehearsed theatricality. "I am done playing the dutiful, supportive wife to a stingy, boring old man. I have spent my best years suffocating in a marriage devoid of passion or generosity. Tonight is not just your retirement, Douglas. It is my liberation." The guests gasped. A few colleagues looked away in deep discomfort. But the sound that shattered my heart did not come from the crowd's shock. It came from the front table. My 36-year-old son Justin and my 33-year-old daughter Megan stood up. They began to clap. Justin let out a loud, piercing whistle. Megan cheered, raising her glass toward her mother, my own flesh and blood. The son whose failing business ventures I had silently bailed out month after month. The daughter whose lavish lifestyle I had fully funded just to keep the peace. They were applauding my public execution. They looked at me with undisguised contempt, celebrating the woman who was publicly tearing my dignity to shreds. They assumed they were backing the winning horse. They assumed Patricia would take the house, the pension, and whatever meager savings they thought I possessed, leaving me to rot in a cheap apartment. A lesser man would have lost his temper. A lesser man would have screamed, demanded explanations, or pleaded for his dignity in front of 50 silent spectators. I did none of those things. The shock quickly evaporated, replaced by a cold, mathematical clarity. I had spent my career dealing with ruthless corporate takeovers and hostile negotiations. My family had just initiated a hostile takeover of my life. I accepted the terms instantly. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and retrieved my fountain pen. I walked over to the catering table, pushed aside a tray of stale appetizers, and smoothed the divorce papers out on the white linen tablecloth. I flipped directly to the back page. Without a single moment of hesitation, I signed my name on the dotted line. Patricia watched me, her triumphant smile faltering slightly. She expected a fight. She wanted a messy scene to justify her narrative of the oppressive husband. By giving her exactly what she asked for, without a drop of resistance, I denied her the satisfaction. I picked up the signed documents and handed them back to her. I stepped into her personal space close enough to smell the expensive perfume I had paid for. I leaned down until my lips were inches from her ear. "You have no idea what you just did," I whispered. I pulled away. She blinked, a brief flash of uncertainty crossing her features. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the keys to the luxury SUV she drove, a vehicle leased entirely under my corporate account, and dropped them into her empty plastic champagne cup. They landed with a dull, hollow clatter. I turned my back on my cheering children, my stunned colleagues, and my former wife. I walked out of the double doors and into the cool evening air. I did not look back. I took a taxi to a mid-range extended-stay motel on the edge of town. I needed a staging ground. While I unpacked my single overnight bag, Patricia was already moving to secure her victory. Believing she had caught me off guard, she called her aggressive divorce attorney first thing the next morning. Her instructions were ruthless and predictable. She wanted an immediate freeze placed on all our joint banking accounts, our investment portfolios, and the home equity lines. She intended to cut off my access to my own money, starving me out legally while she occupied the estate. A few hours later, I sat at the small desk in my motel room, sipping black coffee when my phone vibrated. It was a notification from my private corporate attorney. Patricia's lawyer had successfully executed the freeze on the marital accounts. But the victory was entirely hollow. When her lawyer accessed the financial ledgers, he made a paralyzing discovery. The joint checking accounts, the shared savings, the emergency funds. They were all completely empty. They bore a balance of $0 and 0 cents. I had seen the cracks in my marriage months ago and had already quietly and legally separated my vast corporate assets and personal wealth from the marital pool. Patricia thought she had drawn first blood. She did not realize she had just walked willingly into a financial guillotine. The room at the extended stay motel smelled of stale bleach and old carpet. I sat at a wobbly particle board desk, illuminated only by the harsh glare of the neon vacancy sign buzzing outside my window. The mattress was lumpy and the walls were paper thin. To Patricia and my children, this was exactly where I belonged. They pictured me sitting on the edge of a cheap bed, weeping over the loss of my family, and wondering how I would survive on a fixed income. I was not weeping. I was pouring myself a cup of bitter instant coffee and opening my encrypted laptop. For decades, my family believed a very specific lie about my career. Patricia loved to complain to her country club friends that she was married to a stagnant mid-level logistics manager. She mocked my long hours. Justin and Megan rolled their eyes whenever I talked about supply chain management. They saw me as a corporate drone grinding out a miserable existence for a standard paycheck. They never bothered to look closer. If they had paid attention, they would have noticed that 15 years ago, the logistics firm I worked for was on the brink of absolute bankruptcy. During that crisis, I did not panic. I quietly liquidated my personal stock portfolios, secured a massive private loan, and bought out the failing company from the inside. I restructured the entire organization. Over the next 15 years, I turned a dying shipping company into a regional empire. I am not a mid-level manager. I am the majority shareholder and the sole owner of a highly lucrative enterprise. I never told Patricia. I knew exactly what she would do with that information. She would have drained the company dry to fund a life of obscene luxury. I chose to protect my legacy by living quietly. My wealth grew in the shadows, safely hidden behind layers of corporate trusts. Now, sitting in the cheap motel room, I logged into my secure private server. Patricia had initiated a war, assuming I was an unarmed man. It was time to show her the real battlefield. I began a forensic audit of the finances she thought she controlled. I accessed the property records for the 5-bedroom house she was currently occupying. I expected to find some reckless credit card debt or a few depleted savings accounts. What I found was a masterpiece of financial deception. 3 years ago, Patricia had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on our family home. She had forged my consent using a digital signature tool. She had pulled out hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity. I tracked the flow of the stolen money. It did not go toward home improvements or investments. The ledgers revealed a sickening pattern of secret luxury vacations to overseas casinos, high-end designer boutiques, and massive cash withdrawals. She had been treating the roof over our heads as a personal piggy bank. She assumed my steady executive salary would cover the minimum monthly payments indefinitely. By serving me those divorce papers, she thought she was securing the house for herself. She did not realize she had just claimed sole ownership of a ticking financial time bomb. I documented every fraudulent transaction. I compiled the evidence into a secure file. Because she had filed for divorce, and I had formally accepted the separation of our assets, I was legally permitted to sever my liability. I drafted an emergency declaration to the lending bank, exposing the forged digital signature and officially disputing the debt. Patricia was now completely isolated. She was personally responsible for a suffocating monthly payment she had no means to pay. I turned my attention to my son. Justin had always been a master of appearances. He operated a luxury car dealership downtown. He wore imported suits and drove a different sports car every week. He loved to belittle my conservative approach to business, calling me a dinosaur who did not understand the modern hustle. I pulled up the commercial lending records for his dealership. I had contacts at his primary bank, and a few keystrokes gave me access to the guarantor files for his inventory loans. My blood turned to ice water. The loans keeping his dealership afloat were staggering. Millions of dollars in commercial debt were tied up in the shiny luxury vehicles sitting on his lot. But Justin did not have the credit to secure those loans on his own. I opened the scanned copies of the promissory notes. There at the bottom of every single page was my signature. My own son had forged my name to act as the primary guarantor for his entire business. He had bet my financial life on his vanity project without ever saying a word to me. The betrayal was so profound, it almost took my breath away. He stood at my retirement party and whistled in celebration as his mother destroyed my public dignity, all while secretly using my name to keep himself out of bankruptcy. He thought I was a fool who would never check the commercial registries. He thought he could keep riding my coattails forever. I did not call him. I did not demand an explanation or a tearful apology. An apology is useless when the crime is this calculated. I opened my email client and drafted a direct message to the senior fraud investigator at the commercial bank holding Justin's inventory loans. I attached undeniable proof of my actual signature alongside the clumsy forgeries Justin had submitted. I informed the bank that I was not a guarantor, that I had never authorized these loans, and that the owner of the dealership had committed felony fraud to secure their capital. I hit send. The email vanished into the digital ether. It was a silent action, but its impact would be catastrophic. I closed the encrypted laptop and took a sip of the cold, instant coffee. The cheap motel room felt like a luxury suite. I had systematically severed every financial parasite feeding off my life. I lay down on the lumpy mattress and went to sleep feeling a profound, absolute peace. The sun rose the next morning, illuminating the city with a harsh, bright light. Justin woke up in his upscale apartment, put on a tailored Italian suit, and kissed his wife goodbye. He drove his leased sports car toward the downtown district, completely unaware that the ground beneath him had vanished in the middle of the night. He arrived at his luxury car dealership, expecting to unlock the doors and play the role of the successful entrepreneur. He pulled his car up to the main entrance. He did not find his employees waiting to start the day. Instead, he found 3 unmarked vans blocking the driveway. Men in dark windbreakers were actively bolting heavy steel padlocks onto the wrought iron gates of his property. The bank had moved with terrifying speed. His inventory was locked down. His business was seized. His life was over. Justin stepped out of his car, staring at the padlocks, as the reality of his total destruction finally caught up to him. I knew exactly how Patricia would spend her first weekend as a supposedly liberated woman. She loved an audience, and she loved to celebrate victories she had not actually earned. That Sunday morning, the sprawling 5-bedroom house was bathed in bright sunlight. Patricia hosted a lavish divorce celebration brunch in our formal dining room. She invited our daughter Megan and our daughter-in-law Natalie. The three of them sat around the custom mahogany table sipping expensive mimosas poured from crystal carafes and picking at imported cheeses and artisan pastries. Patricia held court at the head of the table. She spoke loudly about her brilliant legal strategy and how easily she had discarded me at the retirement party. She bragged about the current real estate market. She told Megan and Natalie that she was bringing in a premium appraiser the following week. She fully believed she owned the estate free and clear. She painted a vivid picture of selling the property for several $1 million, downsizing to a luxury penthouse downtown, and using the leftover cash to fund a permanent vacation. She even promised to give Megan and Natalie a generous cut of the profits to fund their own lavish lifestyles. They toasted to their newfound wealth, entirely unaware that they were drinking champagne on the deck of a sinking ship. Right around noon, the heavy brass doorbell echoed through the foyer. Patricia stood up, smoothing her designer silk robe. She probably expected a delivery of fresh flowers, or perhaps a neighbor coming to offer congratulations on her bold new chapter. She walked to the front door with a half-empty champagne flute in her hand, wearing a triumphant smile. She swung the heavy oak door open. It was not a florist. A man in a plain polo shirt stood on the porch holding a thick legal envelope. He asked to confirm her identity. Patricia, annoyed by the interruption, arrogantly confirmed who she was. The man handed her the envelope, informed her she had been officially served, and walked away without another word. Patricia closed the door and carried the envelope back to the kitchen island. Megan and Natalie were still laughing in the dining room, oblivious to the shift in the atmosphere. Patricia set her champagne glass down on the marble countertop and tore open the thick paper flap. She slid the documents out and stared at the bold black letters printed across the top of the first page. Notice of default and intent to foreclose. The color instantly drained from her face. The triumphant smile vanished, replaced by a look of absolute, unadulterated terror. The laughter in the dining room faded as Megan and Natalie noticed the deafening silence radiating from the kitchen. Patricia could not comprehend the words on the page because she had spent years living inside a carefully constructed delusion. For the past decade, she had been funding a secret double life. Those women-only charity retreats she claimed to attend in Monaco and Las Vegas were nothing but high-stakes gambling binges. Her closet was bursting with limited-edition designer handbags and custom jewelry she hid from me. To finance this hidden addiction, she had forged my digital signature and taken out a massive home equity line of credit against our estate. She drained hundreds of thousands of dollars from the property. She never worried about the astronomical $15,000 minimum monthly payments because my steady executive paycheck had always been there to silently absorb the blow. She simply assumed my income would continue to replenish the joint accounts, forever covering her tracks without me ever noticing. But Patricia had made a fatal miscalculation when she handed me those divorce papers in front of my colleagues. By publicly initiating the divorce and demanding an immediate separation of our assets, she had officially severed our financial ties. The moment I signed those papers and walked out of the banquet hall, I was legally unburdened. Furthermore, as soon as I accessed my encrypted laptop in that motel room and discovered the forged equity line, I immediately filed a formal dispute with the lending bank. I provided irrefutable proof that I had never authorized the loan and that the signature was a digital forgery. The bank moved swiftly to protect their capital. Banks do not care about divorce drama or family celebrations. They care entirely about liability and fraud. They legally detached my name from the fraudulent debt and transferred the entire suffocating burden squarely onto Patricia. She was now solely responsible for a massive loan she had no possible way to repay. She had no job. She had no corporate income. She had no access to my hidden wealth. She was staring at a $15,000 bill that was due immediately, and the bank was already moving to seize the house to recoup their stolen funds. The millions of dollars she had just promised to split with her daughter and daughter-in-law did not exist. The estate belonged to the bank. Patricia dropped the foreclosure notice onto the counter. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably, and she struggled to pull air into her lungs. Megan walked into the kitchen, annoyed by the sudden shift in mood. She picked up the discarded papers and read the foreclosure notice. Megan saw the reality of the situation immediately. Her mother was entirely bankrupt and mere weeks away from being physically removed from the premises. But Megan was the chief executive officer of a tech startup. She was used to playing the savior and throwing money at her problems. She put a comforting hand on her mother's shoulder and pulled out her smartphone. She confidently promised to wire Patricia the past due balance directly from her startup's corporate operating accounts to temporarily hold the bank at bay. Megan logged into her mobile banking application, ready to transfer the funds and prove her own success. She expected to see the massive balance waiting to be deployed. The screen loaded for a moment before flashing a bright red error message. Access denied. Account frozen. Megan frowned and immediately dialed her dedicated banking representative, demanding an aggressive explanation. The representative's voice was completely devoid of sympathy. The primary anonymous overseas investor, the sole financial backbone of Megan's entire company, had completely frozen the startup's operating capital, pending an immediate federal audit. Megan lowered the phone, her face turning as pale as her mother's. She looked at Patricia and Natalie with wide, terrified eyes. The lifeline was dead. Megan's startup was an illusion built on arrogance and fake metrics. She and her husband Trevor loved to posture as self-made visionaries. They attended industry galas and gave interviews about their disruptive technology. But behind the glossy magazine covers and the endless stream of corporate buzzwords, their company was bleeding cash. They survived entirely because a mysterious overseas holding company had injected millions in Series A and Series B funding. When the bank representative informed Megan that the overseas investor had frozen her operating accounts, her artificial empire began to collapse within hours. The panic was immediate and absolute. Payroll was due on Friday. Server hosting costs were severely delinquent. Without access to their primary capital, the company would default by the end of the week. Trevor spent 48 hours frantically calling proxy numbers and emailing encrypted addresses, desperately trying to track down the anonymous benefactor who held their financial lives in his hands. Finally, my corporate liaison responded. The investor agreed to a single emergency face-to-face meeting at a high-rise executive suite in the downtown financial district. They arrived at the skyscraper precisely on time. I watched them on the building's security feed. Megan wore a sharp, tailored suit, clutching her tablet like a shield. Trevor paced the marble lobby, adjusting his tie, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. They rehearsed their pitches in the elevator, preparing to dazzle a foreign billionaire with promises of exponential growth and scaled user acquisition. They walked out on the 50th floor and were escorted down a long, quiet corridor by a silent receptionist. The heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Megan and Trevor walked in wearing their most confident, polished smiles. They expected to find a team of European bankers or a ruthless hedge fund manager. Instead, they found me. I sat alone at the far end of a 30-foot polished mahogany table, pouring a cup of black coffee from a silver carafe. Megan stopped dead in her tracks. Her professional smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, confused irritation. She looked around the empty boardroom, assuming there had been some sort of scheduling error. Then her eyes snapped back to me, filling with that familiar, condescending contempt she had displayed at my retirement party. She genuinely believed I had tracked her down to beg for a handout after Patricia supposedly took my house. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "I have a crucial meeting with my primary investor in exactly 2 minutes. If you are here to ask for money because Mom kicked you out, you have lost your mind. Get out before I have building security drag you to the street." I did not raise my voice. I took a slow sip of my coffee, set the porcelain cup down on the saucer, and slid a leather-bound folio across the smooth surface of the table. It stopped precisely in front of her empty chair. "Sit down, Megan," I said. "You are not waiting for anyone else. Your meeting started the second you walked through those doors." Trevor looked at the folio, then looked at me, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Megan let out a harsh, mocking laugh. She refused to sit. She crossed her arms, looking at me as if I were a delusional old man playing a pathetic prank. "You are not the investor," she sneered. "Our backing comes from a private equity firm in Luxembourg. You are a retired logistics manager who just lost everything in a divorce. Stop playing games and get out." I opened my own copy of the folio. 3 years ago, I began reading. Keeping my tone perfectly flat, you and Trevor were rejected by every venture capital firm in the tri-state area. Your business model was flawed. Your projections were unrealistic. You were a month away from personal bankruptcy. Suddenly, an overseas firm named Zenith Holdings injected $2 million into your operating accounts, saving you from complete ruin. You loved telling magazines you were a self-made woman. You never knew that Zenith Holdings is a subsidiary of a trust I created 15 years ago. I am the sole director. I bought your success. I built the safety net you so arrogantly danced upon. The color completely drained from Megan's face. She looked down at the leather folio in front of her. Trevor reached out with trembling hands and flipped it open. Inside were the original articles of incorporation, the wire transfer receipts, and the trust documents proving my absolute ownership of their financial lifeline. The realization hit them with the force of a freight train. The father she had mocked and humiliated was the phantom billionaire who owned her entire life. Trevor dropped into the chair beside him, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. Megan remained standing, but her posture had entirely collapsed. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning white. "Why did you freeze the accounts?" she asked, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "We were going to launch our new software next month. We just needed a bridge loan. You are destroying your own investment." "I am not destroying anything," I replied calmly. "I am simply amputating a diseased limb." I pulled a second file from my briefcase. I did not need to yell. The mathematical evidence was devastating enough. I explained that I had initiated a routine audit of their corporate ledgers prior to releasing the Series B funding. What I found was a spectacular masterpiece of corporate fraud. Megan and Trevor had not been building a legitimate software company. They had been moving their original seed capital back and forth between a dozen offshore shell accounts. They were creating fake invoices and phantom client transactions to artificially inflate their revenue and user engagement metrics. "You lied to the tech blogs," I stated. "You lied to the secondary investors. You fabricated your entire quarterly earnings report to trigger the release of more funding. You built a Ponzi scheme wrapped in Silicon Valley buzzwords." Trevor tried to interject, his voice cracking with panic. He attempted to use corporate jargon to deflect the accusation. He claimed they were just employing aggressive accounting strategies, that it was standard practice for startups trying to secure market dominance, and that they could restructure the books if I gave them a 30-day grace period. I silenced him by sliding a heavy spiral-bound binder across the table. It bore the official blue and gold seal of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. "Aggressive accounting is a tax penalty, Trevor," I said, looking him dead in the eyes. "What you and my daughter have done is federal wire fraud. As the primary stakeholder of your company, I am legally obligated to report severe financial irregularities to protect my own corporate liability. I did not just freeze your accounts. I submitted your unredacted ledgers, your fake invoices, and your internal communications directly to the federal government." Megan let out a sharp, choked gasp. She fell back into her chair, covering her mouth with both hands. She was no longer a wealthy tech founder. She was a criminal suspect, realizing the trap had already snapped shut. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the sound of Trevor breathing heavily, his chest heaving as the gravity of federal prisons settled over his shoulders. Megan turned to her husband, her eyes wide with desperation, silently pleading for him to say something brilliant, to find a legal loophole, to defend the empire they had built together. She expected him to stand by her side and fight the accusations. Instead, Trevor looked at the SEC binder, looked at the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, and then looked directly at me. The survival instinct of a cornered animal took complete control. He pushed his chair away from Megan, creating a physical distance between them. "Mr. Barrett," Trevor said, his voice dropping to a rapid, frantic pitch. "I was just the operations manager. I handled the staff and the software development. Megan was the chief executive. She handled all the financial routing. She was the one moving the money through the shell accounts. She kept me out of the billing loop." "Trevor, what are you doing?" Megan screamed, grabbing his arm. "We did this together." Trevor violently shook her hand off. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes locked entirely on me, his expression twisted with cowardly desperation. "I can prove it," Trevor pleaded, ignoring his wife's sobbing. "I have emails. I have text messages where she explicitly tells me not to look at the quarterly ledgers. If you can talk to the SEC, if you can protect me from the federal indictment, I will sign a sworn affidavit today. I will give you everything you need to lock her away. Just tell me what you need me to say." I sat back in my chair, folding my hands on the table, watching the total collapse of their marriage. The arrogance was completely eradicated. Trevor was eagerly offering to destroy my daughter to save his own skin, exactly as I knew he would. What do you think he deserves next? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Less than 24 hours after the boardroom massacre, my burner phone buzzed with an encrypted text message. It was Trevor. He was terrified, desperate, and begging for a private audience. He suggested a highly exclusive country club, a place where he still delusionally believed he held some social standing. I refused. I dictated the terms. We met at a rundown fluorescent-lit diner on the industrial edge of the city, a place where the coffee tasted like burnt copper and the floor tiles were permanently sticky. I wanted him entirely out of his element. I wanted him to feel the profound reality of his impending poverty. Trevor arrived 20 minutes early. When I walked through the glass doors, he was sitting in a corner booth, sweating profusely into the collar of his designer shirt. His eyes darted nervously around the empty diner, jumping at every clatter of silverware from the kitchen. He looked like a hunted animal. I slid into the vinyl booth across from him. I did not offer a greeting. I simply signaled the tired waitress to bring a pot of black coffee and 2 thick ceramic mugs. Trevor leaned forward, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. He did not waste time with pleasantries or apologies. The instinct for self-preservation had stripped away whatever thin veneer of loyalty he possessed toward my daughter. "Mr. Barrett," he started, his voice a frantic, breathless whisper. "I know what the Securities and Exchange Commission can do. I know the federal minimum sentencing guidelines for wire fraud. I cannot go to a federal penitentiary. I am willing to give you everything. I have physical hard drives, internal memos, and unencrypted emails. I can prove Megan was the sole architect of the shell accounts. I can prove Patricia was actively using our corporate routing numbers to wash her gambling debts. I will testify in open court. I will stand before a federal judge and hand you their heads on a silver platter. All I ask in return is that you shield me from the financial liability and provide me with complete immunity from your corporate legal team." I did not interrupt him. I poured the burnt coffee into my mug, watching the dark liquid swirl. I pushed the second mug toward him, a silent invitation to continue. A man desperate to save his own skin will rarely stop at the immediate crime. He will dig up every buried skeleton to prove his worth. I took a slow sip and simply nodded. Trevor took that nod as a green light, to betray a decade of family secrets. He began to sing like a canary, detailing every manipulative scheme Megan had orchestrated against me over the last 10 years. He confessed that Megan had artificially inflated her university tuition costs by tens of thousands of dollars, fabricating fake university housing invoices to trick me into funding her extravagant backpacking trips across Europe. He revealed how she had continuously stolen from my emergency medical funds, claiming she had sudden, uninsured health crises when she was actually purchasing designer wardrobes. But the most sickening revelation was regarding the retirement party. Trevor wiped the sweat from his forehead and leaned in closer, his voice dropping an octave. He told me that Megan and Patricia had spent 6 entire months choreographing the ambush at the banquet hall. They had intentionally selected the cheapest catering package to save money for their post-divorce celebration brunch. They had specifically invited my most esteemed colleagues to maximize my public humiliation. Megan had theorized that if they broke my spirit in front of my peers, I would be too depressed and humiliated to fight the asset division. They had laughed about it over expensive wine, mocking my predictable nature, betting on my silence. Trevor laid bare the absolute moral bankruptcy of my family. He offered them up with the eager, pathetic desperation of a coward trying to buy his way onto a lifeboat. He reached into his leather briefcase and slid a printed non-disclosure and immunity agreement across the sticky table. It was a clumsily drafted document, likely pulled from the internet in a panic, demanding debt, forgiveness, and legal protection in exchange for his testimony. He handed me a pen, looking at me with wide, pleading eyes. I looked at the document. Then I looked at the man who had slept beside my daughter for 5 years. I did not sign the paper. I did not touch the pen. I took a $5 bill from my wallet, dropped it onto the table to cover the coffee, and stood up. I looked down at him with absolute chilling indifference. I told him I would take his generous offer under advisement, but I promised him absolutely nothing. I walked out of the diner, leaving him sitting alone in the harsh fluorescent light, clutching his useless immunity agreement. I returned to my motel room. The air was still stale, but the atmosphere felt charged with the electricity of absolute control. I sat at my particle board desk and connected my smartphone to my encrypted laptop. Trevor was a fool. He was so consumed by his own terror that he never stopped to consider why I had chosen a loud public diner with no expectation of privacy. He never noticed that my phone had been sitting face up on the table for the entire hour. I had recorded every single second of his pathetic, treacherous confession in crystal-clear, high-definition audio. I did not edit the file. I did not add a dramatic message or a threatening caption. I simply attached the raw audio file to an anonymous email and sent it directly to Megan's personal smartphone. I closed the laptop, leaned back in my chair, and waited for gravity to do its perfect, uncompromising work. Megan was sitting at a crowded upscale outdoor cafe in the downtown shopping district. She was desperately scrolling through her contacts, trying to secure a crisis management public relations firm to handle the impending collapse of her tech startup. Her phone chimed with an email notification. Seeking any distraction from her crumbling reality, she opened the file and put her wireless earbuds in. Sitting amidst the wealthy socialites and expensive brunch plates, Megan listened to the voice of her husband. She heard Trevor calmly and eagerly trading her freedom for his own. She heard him detail her teenage thefts, her fraudulent invoices, and her cruel orchestration of my retirement ambush. She heard the man she loved offer to stand in a federal courtroom and destroy her life to save his own skin. Trevor arrived at this cafe 10 minutes later, entirely unaware of the execution order that had just been delivered. He walked up to her table, adjusting his designer sunglasses, probably preparing to tell her some fabricated lie about his morning meetings. He never even got the chance to speak. Megan did not yell right away. She stood up, her face completely drained of color, her eyes wide with a manic, unhinged fury. She picked up her heavy glass of iced coffee and hurled it directly into Trevor's face. The glass shattered against his shoulder, splashing dark liquid and ice cubes across his expensive suit. The sharp crack of breaking glass silenced the entire patio. Every patron turned to watch, Then the screaming began. Megan erupted into a spectacular, violent, completely unhinged meltdown. She shrieked accusations of treason, calling him a coward, a parasite, and a traitor. She flipped the wrought iron cafe table, sending plates of food crashing to the concrete. Trevor, dripping with coffee and sheer panic, tried to grab her arms to quiet her down, but she struck him across the face with her purse. The high society marriage they had spent years curating for social media crumbled into a viral spectacle of shattered porcelain and screaming accusations. Dozens of patrons pulled out their phones, recording the humiliating collapse of the tech world's favorite power couple. Cafe management scrambled to intervene, ultimately calling the police to physically escort a hysterical Megan off the premises, while Trevor stood completely paralyzed by the public destruction of his life. While the police sirens wailed in the distance, echoing through the downtown streets, the domino effect of my silent adjustments reached its next target. Justin was standing in the driveway of his padlocked luxury car dealership. He was furiously screaming into his cell phone, demanding that his bank representative lift the freeze on his inventory. He was pacing back and forth, completely consumed by his own financial suffocation. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb, parking illegally in the fire lane. Two men in sharp conservative suits stepped out. They did not look like bank repossession agents. They walked with the heavy, undeniable authority of federal law enforcement. They approached Justin, interrupting his frantic phone call. One of the men asked to confirm his identity. Justin, irritated and arrogant to the very end, snapped his name at them. The man reached into his breast pocket and handed Justin a thick, sealed legal envelope. It was a direct court summons. He was being formally indicted for felony commercial fraud, identity theft, and corporate forgery. The walls had not just closed in, they had completely crushed him. The air inside the downtown legal conference room was heavy, smelling of expensive leather polish and stale, bitter coffee. I sat perfectly still at the long, polished mahogany table, keeping my hands folded calmly in my lap. Next to me sat Warren Gallagher, my private corporate attorney. Warren did not look like a standard divorce lawyer. He wore a muted charcoal suit and carried himself with the quiet, terrifying stillness of a man who dismantled corporate empires before his morning commute. Across the wide table sat Patricia. Despite her impending home foreclosure and her total lack of liquid cash, she had managed to dress the part of the aggrieved, wealthy socialite. She wore a tailored white linen suit and an oversized pearl necklace, projecting an aura of absolute invincibility. Beside her was Richard Croft, a notoriously loud and aggressive divorce attorney she had hired on a contingency basis. Croft was a legal predator who operated on intimidation. Patricia had promised him a massive percentage of my life's work, and he was eager to collect. Croft opened his thick leather briefcase with a loud, theatrical snap. He pulled out a massive stack of heavily tabbed documents and slapped them onto the center of the table. He did not offer any professional pleasantries. He launched directly into his rehearsed intimidation tactics, his voice booming off the glass walls of the conference room. He stated that his client Patricia was the ultimate victim of long-term financial abuse. He claimed that I had deliberately and maliciously concealed my true wealth from my family for over a decade. Therefore, he argued Patricia was legally entitled to maximum punitive compensation for her years of emotional suffering. Croft began listing her demands with supreme arrogance. He demanded exactly 50% of my executive retirement pension. He demanded lifetime spousal support, set at a premium tier to maintain the extravagant standard of living she had grown accustomed to. And then he dropped what he believed was his ultimate bombshell. He announced that their private investigators were fully aware I was the majority shareholder of the logistics firm. He demanded an immediate transfer of half my corporate shares or a cash equivalent buyout, which he gleefully estimated to be in the tens of millions of dollars. Patricia leaned back in her plush leather chair and crossed her arms. She looked at me with a smug, deeply self-satisfied grin. She genuinely believed this deposition was merely a formality before her grand coronation. She thought the recent foreclosure notices and her frozen bank accounts were just temporary hurdles, minor inconveniences that would instantly evaporate. The second, a judge ordered me to surrender my empire. She looked across the table expecting to see a broken, terrified old man begging to negotiate a settlement to keep his company intact. She expected me to panic at the sheer threat of a prolonged, highly public court battle. I did not say a single word. I simply turned my head and looked at Warren. Warren took a slow, deliberate sip of his ice water. He did not open a briefcase. He did not produce a massive stack of intimidating files. He reached into his slim leather portfolio and pulled out a single, very thin piece of paper. He slid it across the smooth surface of the mahogany table. The paper glided silently, stopping precisely in front of Mr. Croft. Croft looked down at the single page, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He picked it up with a scoff, likely expecting a meager settlement offer or a desperate plea for mediation. As his eyes scanned the printed text, the aggressive posture completely melted from his shoulders. He went rigid. He read the page a second time, his eyes widening in alarm, tracing the specific lines of text, as if trying to find a misprint that could save him. Patricia noticed her lawyer's sudden paralysis. She frowned, her smug expression slipping into annoyance. She asked him what the document was, her voice tinged with a sudden sharp edge of anxiety. Croft did not answer her. He just kept staring at the paper, the color draining from his face until he looked physically ill. 10 years ago, when I quietly restructured my logistics firm to finalize my majority buyout, I understood the severe risks of extreme wealth. I knew Patricia possessed an insatiable, reckless appetite for spending. I needed an ironclad firewall to protect my life's work from her inevitable financial disasters. At the time, I told her the company was undergoing a highly risky tax restructuring. I presented her with a document I claimed was a strict liability waiver. I told her that signing it would legally protect her personal assets from being seized if my company ever went bankrupt or faced federal tax audits. Patricia had been so overwhelmingly eager to protect her own luxury lifestyle that she signed the paper immediately without ever bothering to read the fine print or consult her own independent legal counsel. Warren finally broke the suffocating silence in the conference room. His voice was calm, measured, and absolutely lethal. He informed Mr. Croft that the document trembling in his hands was a fully executed, legally binding post-nuptial agreement. It had been notarized, witnessed, and filed with the state 10 years prior. Warren explained that the agreement contained a highly specific, non-negotiable financial morality clause. It explicitly stated that if either party incurred hidden debt, engaged in secret financial liabilities, or encumbered shared marital property, without the express written consent of the other spouse, that offending party completely and permanently forfeited all claims to the other's corporate assets, pensions, and future spousal support. Patricia snatched the document from her lawyer's hands. She stared at her own signature at the bottom of the page. The blue ink faded, but undeniably hers. She demanded to know what it meant, her voice rising to a frantic, shrill pitch that echoed off the glass walls. Warren folded his hands on the table and looked directly at her. He explained that by forging my digital signature to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars in secret home equity loans, and by accumulating astronomical hidden credit card debt to fund her secret gambling trips, she had unambiguously triggered the forfeiture clause. She had breached the legal contract in the most spectacular and documented way possible. The mathematics of her ruin were brutally simple. Warren laid the reality out for her with surgical precision. Because of the post-nuptial agreement she willingly signed 10 years ago, she had absolutely no legal claim to my corporate shares. My multi-million-dollar logistics company was entirely untouchable. She had no claim to my executive pension. She was not entitled to receive a single penny of spousal support. The millions of dollars she had just celebrated with her daughter and daughter-in-law simply evaporated into thin air. Patricia dropped the paper onto the table. Her hands began to shake wildly. She looked at Croft, screaming at him to do something demanding, that he challenge the document, tear it up, or call it a fraud. Croft slowly clicked his briefcase shut. He looked at his client not with professional sympathy, but with the cold, angry realization that he had taken a massive contingency case for a woman who possessed absolutely nothing of value. He informed her in a flat tone that the document was airtight. There was no legal loophole to exploit. He could not fight it in court, and he was dropping her as a client effective immediately. I sat back in my leather chair and watched the absolute destruction of her reality. She was not walking away with half of a fortune. Because she had proudly initiated the divorce and legally demanded the separation of our assets, and because the forfeiture clause stripped her of any marital bailout, she was walking away with nothing but the terrifying consequences of her own actions. She was leaving this 4-decade marriage with 100% of the $800,000 debt she had secretly accrued. The impending foreclosure on her home was not a temporary setback. It was her permanent reality. She was completely, irreversibly ruined, drowning in an ocean of debt she had dug herself, and I was not throwing her a life preserver. The collapse of a counterfeit empire does not happen quietly. It shatters with a deafening, violent crash that strips away every polite illusion, leaving nothing but the raw, desperate instinct for survival. While Patricia was sitting in a downtown conference room, discovering the absolute zero of her financial reality, her daughter-in-law Natalie was experiencing her own terrifying awakening. Natalie had married my son Justin entirely for the glossy aesthetic of success. She loved the imported sports cars, the exclusive restaurant reservations, and the heavy diamond rings. She had happily ignored the warning signs and the hushed, frantic phone calls Justin made to his creditors. She simply assumed the well of my wealth was bottomless, and that her position in the high society hierarchy was permanently secured. That illusion evaporated the moment federal agents placed Justin in the back of a black sedan and handed him an indictment for commercial fraud. When Natalie tried to access their joint checking accounts to hire a defense attorney, she found them completely frozen by the federal government. She tried to use her platinum credit cards, but every single transaction was aggressively declined. The luxury dealership was padlocked. Her husband was sitting in a holding cell, facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Natalie realized with chilling clarity that she was chained to a sinking anchor. She was not going to play the role of the devoted, supportive wife standing by her man through a criminal trial. She was a mercenary whose contract had just expired, and she knew she needed to run. But running requires liquid capital, and Natalie was entirely broke. She needed untraceable cash, and she knew exactly where to find it. I watched the entire pathetic spectacle unfold in high definition from the discreet security cameras I had installed throughout the estate years ago. Natalie arrived at the sprawling 5-bedroom house just an hour after Patricia had returned from her disastrous deposition. Patricia was in the formal living room, pacing frantically across the Persian rugs, clutching a half-empty glass of vodka. She was muttering to herself, completely unraveled by the knowledge that the post-nuptial agreement had stripped her of everything. Natalie walked through the front door wearing an expression of deep, fabricated concern. She rushed to Patricia, offering open arms and a performance of profound family solidarity. She told her mother-in-law that they needed to stick together, that the legal system was making a terrible mistake, and that they would somehow fight their way out of this nightmare. Patricia, completely consumed by her own catastrophic ruin, eagerly accepted the fake sympathy. She collapsed onto the sofa, sobbing about the cruel injustice of the world and how I had maliciously tricked her into signing her rights away. Natalie sat beside her, rubbing her back and murmuring soothing, empty words. She patiently waited for Patricia to drown her panic in another heavy pour of vodka. When Patricia finally slumped back against the cushions, utterly exhausted by her own hysterics, she closed her eyes and let the alcohol pull her into a heavy, numb sleep. The moment Patricia's breathing grew deep and rhythmic, the mask of the loving daughter-in-law vanished. Natalie stood up, her eyes turning cold and incredibly focused. She did not call a lawyer to help Justin. She did not look for financial documents to save the house. She walked directly past the sleeping woman and headed straight for the master suite. Patricia's walk-in closet was a monument to her hidden financial sins. It was a massive temperature-controlled room bursting with the spoils of her secret home equity loans. Natalie knew exactly what she was looking for. She unzipped a large black canvas duffel bag she had smuggled inside her designer coat. She moved through the closet with the terrifying efficiency of a seasoned burglar. She bypassed the bulky evening gowns and went straight for the high-yield accessories. She swept 4 limited-edition Chanel handbags off the top shelf and shoved them into the duffel. She pulled open the velvet-lined accessory drawers and began scooping up the heavy gold bracelets, the diamond tennis necklaces, and the vintage brooches Patricia had hoarded over the decades. She did not stop there. Natalie moved quietly out of the bedroom and crept downstairs to the formal dining room. She opened the antique credenza and began pulling out the solid silver cutlery sets, hurriedly wrapping them in cloth napkins to keep them from clinking together. She was stripping the estate of anything that could be easily pawned or sold for untraceable cash to fund her escape across state lines. She was so consumed by her frantic scavenging that she failed to hear the heavy footsteps coming down the hallway. Patricia had woken up. The alcohol had not kept her asleep for long, and the sudden quiet in the house had put her on edge. She walked into the dining room expecting to find her daughter-in-law making a pot of coffee. Instead, she found Natalie violently stuffing a silver gravy boat into a bulging canvas bag alongside her most prized designer purses. The silence that stretched between them was electric and absolute. The two women stood frozen, staring at each other across the mahogany dining table. For years, they had bonded over their shared contempt for me. They had sat at this very table drinking imported wine and laughing at my boring logistics career, eagerly anticipating the day they would divide my wealth. Now the illusion of their high-class solidarity was completely eradicated. They were just two desperate animals trapped in a burning building, fighting over the remaining scraps. "What do you think you are doing?" Patricia hissed, her voice shaking with a rage that instantly sobered her up. Natalie did not cower. She zipped the duffel bag shut with a sharp, aggressive tug. "I am taking what is owed to me," she snapped back, her tone dripping with venom. "Justin is rotting in a jail cell because he was trying to keep up with your insane standard of living. This family is bankrupt, and I am not going down with your sinking ship." "You ungrateful little parasite!" Patricia screamed, lunging across the room. "Put my things back right now. You are not walking out of this house with a single dime of my property." "Your property?" Natalie laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "None of this is yours, Patricia. You do not own this house. You do not own these bags. You are a broke, delusional old woman who signed away her entire life because she was too stupid to read a contract. You have absolutely nothing." The insult hit Patricia like a physical blow. The last fragile thread holding her sanity together violently snapped. She threw herself at Natalie, her hands curling into claws, reaching for the younger woman's face. The polite, wealthy socialites completely vanished, replaced by a feral, shrieking brawl. They crashed into the antique credenza, sending crystal vases shattering across the hardwood floor. Natalie swung the heavy duffel bag, striking Patricia squarely in the shoulder. Patricia retaliated by grabbing a handful of Natalie's perfectly styled hair, yanking her backward with terrifying force. They rolled across the dining room floor, screaming vicious obscenities at each other, destroying the very room they used to host their elegant dinner parties. Natalie was younger and fighting with the adrenaline of pure panic. She managed to break Patricia's grip, driving her elbow hard into her mother-in-law's ribs. Patricia gasped for air, falling back against the broken crystal. Natalie scrambled to her feet, clutching the heavy canvas bag to her chest. Her designer blouse was torn, her face was scratched, and her hair was a wild, tangled mess. She did not look back. She sprinted down the hallway, threw open the heavy oak front door, and ran out onto the manicured front lawn. Patricia dragged herself up from the floor, coughing and clutching her ribs. She stumbled out to the front porch, screaming for Natalie to come back, screaming for the police, screaming at the absolute injustice of the universe. But Natalie had already reached the edge of the driveway. She dropped the duffel bag onto the grass, pulled out her smartphone, and dialed 911. She burst into theatrical, hysterical tears the moment the dispatcher answered the line. She claimed she had just been violently attacked by her deranged mother-in-law. She cried that she had come over to offer emotional support and had been brutally assaulted by a woman who had completely lost her mind. She begged the police to hurry. The response was immediate. Within 3 minutes, the shrill wail of approaching sirens pierced the quiet suburban neighborhood. 2 police cruisers swung onto the street, their red and blue lights washing over the manicured lawns. They pulled to a sharp halt, blocking the driveway. The officers stepped out of their vehicles, hands resting cautiously on their duty belts, assessing the chaotic scene. They saw Natalie weeping hysterically on the grass, with torn clothes, and they saw Patricia standing on the porch, looking completely unhinged, screaming incoherently about stolen handbags. But the police cruisers were not the only vehicles arriving at the estate. Just as the officers began walking up the driveway to separate the 2 screaming women, a heavy commercial utility van turned onto the street. The van parked directly behind the police cruisers. 3 men stepped out wearing thick canvas jackets and carrying heavy steel toolboxes. They did not look like concerned neighbors or medical responders. They were the bank's official repossession agents. The foreclosure notice Patricia had received earlier that weekend was not a gentle warning. Because the debt was tied to proven digital fraud, the bank had expedited an emergency seizure protocol. The men walked up the driveway, completely ignoring the police officers and the weeping daughter-in-law. The lead agent bypassed the chaos, stepped up onto the porch, and handed a terrified Patricia a final immediate eviction order. He did not wait for her to read it. He pulled a heavy commercial drill from his toolbox, turned toward the front door, and began to permanently bore out the locks of the house she thought she owned. The heavy drill bit shattered the brass lock cylinder with a deafening screech, sending sharp metal shavings scattering across the marble threshold. Patricia stood paralyzed on her own front porch, watching the bank-appointed repossession agents systematically dismantle her fortress. She screamed, demanding the police intervene, demanding they arrest the men, drilling into her custom mahogany door. The officers simply stepped back, crossing their arms, and observing the official eviction order the lead agent had shoved into her trembling hands. The legal document was absolute and uncompromising. Because the massive home equity loan was secured through documented digital wire fraud, the bank possessed an emergency federal injunctions to seize the collateral immediately. The lending institution viewed Patricia not as a distressed homeowner, but as a criminal liability. She was given exactly 15 minutes to gather her immediate personal effects before she would be escorted off the premises under the strict threat of criminal trespass. Panic finally overrode her arrogant indignation. She rushed past the expressionless agents, her bare feet slipping dangerously on the broken crystal scattered across the dining room floor from her violent brawl with Natalie. She sprinted up the grand, sweeping staircase to the master suite, dragging 2 large, empty-wheeled suitcases behind her. Patricia did not use her precious 15 minutes to gather sentimental family heirlooms, the old photograph albums or the framed memories of our 4-decade marriage. She went straight for her remaining designer shoes, the heavy cashmere coats, and her velvet jewelry box. She frantically stuffed thousands of dollars of haute couture into the canvas bags, prioritizing the shallow materialistic armor she had always valued above human connection. But in her frantic haste, the suitcases became bloated and impossibly heavy to maneuver down the curved staircase. The repossession agents did not offer to help her carry the luggage. They stood at the bottom of the steps, silently checking their watches. When the 15 minutes expired precisely, 2 police officers walked up the steps, took Patricia firmly by the arms, and physically escorted her out of the house she had stolen from me. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind her. The sound echoed across the manicured lawn, signaling the absolute, irreversible end of her reign. A new heavy steel padlock was immediately bolted to the frame, securing the estate for the bank. Patricia stood barefoot on the concrete curb, her silk designer robe blowing awkwardly in the cold afternoon wind, clutching the handles of her 2 overstuffed suitcases. The wealthy neighbors she had spent years trying to impress and dominate were now standing on their pristine lawns, watching her public humiliation with poorly disguised fascination. She screamed at the bank agents, calling them thieves, threatening them with massive corporate lawsuits she could never afford to fill. They ignored her entirely, getting back into their commercial van and driving away, leaving her completely isolated on the suburban street. She reached into her pocket with trembling fingers, and pulled out her smartphone. She desperately dialed Justin, assuming her golden child, her successful business-owning son, would immediately dispatch a luxury town car to rescue her from this temporary nightmare. The phone rang endlessly before dropping to a cold, automated voicemail. Patricia did not know that at that exact moment, Justin was sitting in a freezing concrete holding cell at the downtown federal courthouse. He had been forcefully stripped of his imported Italian suit and his designer watch, forced to wear a rough, scratchy orange jumpsuit. Federal agents were actively dismantling his fraudulent commercial ledgers in the room next door, while his exhausted public defender advised him to plead guilty immediately to avoid a 20-year maximum sentence. The golden child was entirely buried under the catastrophic avalanche of his own arrogance, completely unable to save himself, let alone rescue his mother. Patricia cursed and frantically dialed Megan, assuming her wealthy tech founder daughter would simply use her corporate card to book a suite at a 5-star downtown hotel. The call went straight to a busy signal. Megan was sitting in a sterile legal conference room, locked in a vicious, bloodletting divorce proceeding. Trevor had formally submitted his sworn written affidavit to the Securities and Exchange Commission, successfully trading his wife's freedom for absolute federal immunity. Megan was staring at a mountain of frozen corporate assets and a looming criminal indictment, desperately trying to liquidate whatever stock she had left to pay her aggressive defense attorney. When her phone lit up with her mother's name, Megan stared at the glowing screen, feeling nothing but profound, bitter resentment. She blamed Patricia entirely for setting the chain of events into motion by publicly humiliating me at the retirement party. Without a single drop of hesitation, Megan pressed the power button, turning her device completely off and severing her mother from her life forever. Patricia stood alone on the curb as the sun began to set, casting long, cold shadows across the exclusive neighborhood she used to rule. The battery on her smartphone was dying. Her bank accounts were locked by the fraud department. Her credit cards were aggressively declined due to non-payment. She had no cash and no remaining allies. The high society friends she used to gossip with had watched the police cruisers leave and immediately retreated into their massive homes, locking their doors and closing their blinds. Not a single person stepped outside to offer her a glass of water or a place to sit. The brutal reality of her complete isolation settled over her shaking shoulders. She was a woman who had spent 60 years valuing money over loyalty, and now she possessed neither. She used the last 4% of her phone battery to call a cheap local cab company, paying the irritated driver with a handful of loose coins and crumpled bills she had scraped from the bottom of her designer purse. She directed the driver away from the wealthy manicured suburbs and toward the industrial edge of the city, where the streetlights flickered and the pavement was cracked and uneven. The cab dropped her off in front of a rundown extended stay motel, its neon vacancy sign buzzing erratically in the dark night air. Patricia dragged her heavy suitcases across the sticky asphalt, stepping over discarded trash and oil stains. She walked into the dingy lobby smelling of stale bleach and old cigarette smoke, her bare feet dirty and aching. She traded her last piece of gold jewelry, a ring I had bought her for our 5th anniversary, to the skeptical night clerk in exchange for a plastic room key. She walked down the dim, flickering corridor and pushed open the heavy wooden door to her room. The mattress was lumpy, the carpet was deeply stained, and the walls were paper-thin. Patricia sat on the edge of the cheap bed, burying her face in her hands, as the absolute destruction of her life finally broke her. She wept uncontrollably, mourning the millions of dollars she foolishly threw away for a brief moment of public applause. She did not realize the poetic absolute perfection of her punishment. By some flawless design of fate, she had checked into the exact same motel chain I had stayed in 6 months ago on the night she handed me those divorce papers. But while that cheap room had been my temporary staging ground for a calculated resurrection for Patricia, it was her permanent, terrifying rock bottom. The concrete floor of the federal holding cell was freezing, leaching the warmth straight out of Justin's bones. He sat on a narrow metal bench, staring at the scuffed toes of his expensive leather shoes. They had taken his belt, his shoelaces, and his imported silk tie. The golden boy of the family, the untouchable entrepreneur, who used to mock my conservative business strategies, was now just another assigned number, waiting for his one permitted phone call. He was surrounded by hardened criminals who did not care about his luxury car dealership or his country club handicap. They only saw a soft, terrified man wearing a bright orange jumpsuit that swallowed his carefully curated pride. When the guard finally allowed him to use the wall-mounted telephone, Justin's hands were shaking so violently he could barely dial the numbers. He called his mother. He assumed Patricia was sitting in the grand, formal living room of the estate, sipping a mimosa and waiting to rescue him with the millions she had bragged about securing in the divorce. He had no idea she was currently sitting on a stained mattress in a roach-infested motel room on the wrong side of the city. Patricia answered on the third ring. Her voice was thin and raspy, stripped of its usual aristocratic arrogance. Justin did not ask how she was. He immediately launched into a frantic, hyperventilating plea. He begged her to wire $50,000 to a local bail bondsman. He promised he would pay her back the second his dealership accounts were unfrozen. He sobbed into the plastic receiver, swearing that he could not survive another night in the federal lockup, that the guards were treating him like an animal, and that he desperately needed his mother to save him. Patricia listened to her golden child weeping. The crushing reality of her absolute bankruptcy pressed down on her lungs. She had $0 to her name. Her credit cards were declined, her home was seized, and she had just traded her last piece of gold jewelry for a cheap motel room. But Patricia was a woman addicted to the illusion of control. She refused to admit her total defeat to her son. She swallowed her panic, forcing a calm, authoritative tone into her voice. She promised Justin she would handle it. She lied beautifully, claiming her primary banking accounts were just locked under a routine security protocol, and that she would secure the cash by the end of the afternoon. She hung up the phone and stared at the peeling wallpaper. She needed $50,000 in untraceable cash, and she needed it in less than 3 hours. Her eyes darted around the miserable room, eventually landing on the bedside table. Resting next to the plastic motel phone was the key fob to her luxury sport utility vehicle. The exact same vehicle I had tossed the keys for into her empty champagne glass 6 months prior. Patricia grabbed the keys and rushed out to the parking lot. The pristine imported vehicle looked utterly ridiculous, parked beneath the flickering neon vacancy sign of the dilapidated motel. It was the last remaining symbol of her artificial wealth. She knew traditional banks would never speak to her, so she drove toward the deep industrial district, pulling into a bleak strip mall that housed a predatory title loan agency. The windows were covered in bright yellow bars, promising instant cash for vehicle titles with no credit checks required. She marched into the dingy office carrying herself with the manufactured entitlement of a wealthy socialite slumming it with the working class. She approached the scratched plexiglass counter and demanded to speak to the manager. She slammed the heavy key fob onto the counter, declaring that she needed an immediate $50,000 collateral loan against the luxury vehicle parked outside. The loan officer, a tired man wearing a faded short-sleeved shirt, did not seem impressed by her designer clothes or her demanding tone. He took the keys, stepped outside to verify the vehicle identification number, and returned to his computer terminal. He typed slowly, waiting for the National Registry database to load. Patricia tapped her manicured fingers impatiently against the plexiglass, already planning the exact route she would drive to the bail bondsman to secure Justin's release. The loan officer stopped typing. He looked at the screen, then looked up at Patricia with a look of profound, mocking amusement. He slid the key fob back across the counter and informed her that he could not issue a loan. Patricia immediately erupted into a predictable rage, threatening to report his business, claiming the vehicle was worth triple what she was asking. The man interrupted her tirade with a harsh, barking laugh. He turned his computer monitor around so she could see the glowing red text on the screen. He told her she could not borrow money against the vehicle because she did not own it. The registry clearly showed the luxury SUV was leased to a corporate fleet belonging to my logistics firm. Furthermore, the database indicated that the vehicle had been officially reported as stolen property by the corporate holding company exactly 6 months ago on the precise morning after the retirement party. Patricia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. I had not given her that car as a parting gift. I had deliberately allowed her to drive a stolen corporate asset for half a year, silently tracking its global positioning system, waiting for the absolute perfect moment to pull the final rug out from under her feet. The loan officer casually reached for his desk phone, informing her that his system automatically notified the local authorities whenever a stolen vehicle identification number was scanned in his shop. Patricia grabbed the keys and sprinted out of the loan office. She threw herself into the driver's seat, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs. She sped out of the strip mall, running a red light in her desperation to escape. She drove wildly through the city, paranoid that every passing siren was coming for her. She finally pulled back into the desolate motel parking lot, killing the engine and slumping over the steering wheel, completely paralyzed by her own foolishness. She thought she had outsmarted me. She had only been driving a highly expensive tracking device. She stepped out of the vehicle, intending to lock herself in her dingy room and hide, but the trap had already snapped shut. Before she could even reach the motel lobby, 2 black and white police cruisers turned sharply into the parking lot, blocking the only exit. Their sirens chirped once, a short, aggressive command. A heavy commercial tow truck backed in right behind them. 2 police officers stepped out, walking briskly toward Patricia. They did not ask for her side of the story. They did not care about her ruined divorce or her son sitting in jail. They simply held out their hands and demanded the key fob to the stolen corporate asset. Patricia did not fight them. The fight had been completely drained out of her. She handed the keys over, watching in absolute crushing silence as the tow truck operator hooked thick steel chains to the front axle of her last remaining piece of luxury. The hydraulic winch whined loudly, dragging the vehicle up onto the flatbed. The police officers handed her a formal citation for possession of stolen property, warning her that my corporate legal team would be pursuing full damages for the mileage and depreciation. Patricia was left standing alone on the sticky, cracked asphalt of the motel parking lot. She had no car, no money, no home, and no family. Miles away inside the federal holding facility, Justin stood by the metal bars of his cell. He had waited 3 hours for the bail bondsman to arrive. He had watched the sun set through the tiny barred window near the ceiling, telling the other inmates that his wealthy mother was bringing $50,000 in cash to walk him out the front door. But as the final evening head count was called and the heavy automated lockdown protocols began, the truth finally crushed his arrogant spirit. The harsh metallic clang of the cell block doors slamming shut echoed through his skull. His mother was not coming. His money was an illusion. The golden child was entirely, irreversibly abandoned. I was completely insulated from their panic. I sat in the quiet, temperature-controlled study of my new lakeside property, listening to the gentle sound of the water lapping against the private dock. The fireplace cast a warm, steady glow across the room. I was pouring myself a glass of sparkling water when my secure laptop chimed with a priority email notification. I set the glass down and opened the message. The sender was Megan. The email was not an apology. It was not a plea for fatherly forgiveness or a lamentation about the destruction of our family. It was a cold, calculated, desperate business proposal. Megan's tech startup had completely evaporated. Trevor had betrayed her to the federal government to secure his own immunity, leaving her facing catastrophic wire fraud charges. She was completely cornered, staring down the barrel of federal prison, and she knew I was the only entity on Earth with the financial firepower to save her. She offered me a Judas deal. Megan wrote that she had secretly backed up every single one of Patricia and Justin's text messages, financial routing numbers, and hidden offshore accounts. She possessed the digital keys to completely incinerate her mother and brother in a court of law. She offered to sell out her own flesh and blood to hand me the absolute, undeniable proof of their decade-long conspiracy against me. All she demanded in return was that I use my corporate legal team to crush Trevor and pay her criminal defense retainer. The daughter who had cheered my public destruction was now eagerly offering to slaughter her own family just to buy her way back into my good graces. The public park was bathed in the harsh gray light of a late autumn afternoon. I chose this location very deliberately. It was completely open, exposed to the elements, and entirely devoid of the insulated luxury my family had grown accustomed to. I sat on a weathered wooden bench near the center fountain, holding a plain paper cup of black coffee purchased from a street vendor. The bitter steam rising from the lid was the only warmth in the freezing air. I was not there to negotiate. I was there to witness the final pathetic thrashing of a parasite that had run out of hosts. Megan arrived exactly 12 minutes late. In her previous life, the 12-minute delay would have been a calculated power play, a subtle way to establish dominance in a corporate meeting. Today, it was simply the result of her total unraveling. I watched her walk down the paved path, and I barely recognized the woman approaching me. The arrogant tech chief executive officer who had clapped and cheered at my public execution was completely gone. She wore a wrinkled trench coat pulled tightly around her shivering frame. Her designer shoes were scuffed. Her hair, usually blown out into a perfect, immaculate shield, was tied back in a messy knot. Her eyes darted wildly, tracking every passing jogger and dog walker with the paranoid intensity of a fugitive. She looked like a woman who knew the federal authorities were monitoring her every single move. She collapsed onto the far edge of the wooden bench, putting as much physical distance between us as the seating allowed. She did not offer a greeting. She did not ask how I was doing after being discarded by her mother. The concept of genuine human empathy was completely foreign to her. She operated entirely on transactional leverage, and right now she believed she held the ultimate trump card. She reached a trembling hand into the deep pocket of her coat and pulled out a small silver flash drive. She held it tightly between her fingers, staring at it as if it were a solid brick of gold. "I have everything," she whispered, her voice hoarse and frantic. "Every single offshore routing number Mom used to hide her gambling debts. I have the digital ledger proving she skimmed equity from your property for the last 5 years. I have text messages from Justin admitting he forged your signature on those commercial loans. I backed up the entire family server before the feds froze my startup accounts. It is all right here on this drive. It is the absolute undeniable proof you need to legally bury them both forever." I did not reach for the silver drive. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, letting the bitter liquid burn the back of my throat. I looked at the daughter I had raised. I remembered a time when she was 17 years old. She had been caught plagiarizing a massive final term paper. Instead of accepting the consequence, she had hacked into the school grading system and altered the timestamp on another student file, framing her own best friend for the theft. She was suspended, but she never showed a single ounce of remorse. She only regretted that her execution was flawed. She was always a mercenary, always eager to slaughter whoever was standing next to her to secure her own survival. "Trevor threw me to the wolves." She continued, her breathing growing rapid and shallow. "He went to the Securities and Exchange Commission and traded my freedom for his own immunity. He handed them the fake revenue ledgers. The federal prosecutors are threatening me with 20 years in a minimum security prison for wire fraud. I have nothing left. My accounts are frozen. My company is dead. But you have your corporate legal team. You have the capital. Take this drive. Use it to destroy Mom and Justin, and in exchange you pay for my criminal defense. You unleash your aggressive lawyers to obliterate Trevor's credibility in federal court. You save me and I hand you the matches to burn the rest of them to the ground." She finally slid the small silver flash drive across the wooden slats of the bench. It stopped mere inches from my coffee cup. She looked at me with wide, desperate eyes, waiting for me to eagerly snatch up the stolen data. She genuinely believed she had orchestrated a brilliant tactical masterstroke. She thought she was proving her ultimate loyalty to the winning side by selling the losers for spare parts. I reached out and picked up the flash drive. The metal was warm from being clutched so tightly in her panicked hands. Megan let out a heavy, trembling sigh of relief, leaning back against the wooden slats. She thought the deal was closed. She thought the terrifying shadow of federal prison had just been lifted by her wealthy father. I held the drive between my thumb and index finger, inspecting the cheap silver casing. Then, without a single change in my expression, without raising my voice or breaking eye contact, I popped the plastic lid off my coffee cup and dropped the flash drive directly into the scalding black liquid. It landed with a soft splash, instantly sinking to the bottom of the paper cup. Megan froze. Her eyes snapped from my face to the steaming coffee and back again. The relief that had just washed over her instantly violently shattered. She lunged forward, letting out a choked, hysterical gasp, reaching her hands out, as if she were going to plunge her fingers into the boiling coffee to retrieve the ruined technology. "What are you doing?" she screamed, her voice cracking with absolute terror. That was the only copy. That was the only proof you had to destroy them. You need that data. I placed the plastic lid back onto the coffee cup, sealing the ruined drive inside. I set the cup down on the bench. "I do not need your stolen data, Megan," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying the quiet, devastating weight of absolute authority. "I mapped your mother offshore accounts 3 weeks before the retirement party. I accessed Justin-forged promissory notes the moment I moved into that motel. I already executed the forensic audit. I already deployed the evidence to the necessary federal and commercial authorities. I hold the high ground. I did not need you to hand me a map to a battlefield I already conquered." Megan stared at me, her jaw trembling uncontrollably. She was struggling to comprehend the massive, terrifying scope of my silent adjustments. She had assumed I was a reactive victim trying to piece together a defense. She just realized I was the architect of the entire collapse. "You came here today, believing betrayal was a valuable currency." I continued, looking deeply into her panicked, tear-filled eyes. "You clapped and whistled while your mother humiliated me in front of my peers. You happily spent the money I bled to earn. And the moment the consequences of your own arrogant fraud came crashing down, you eagerly offered to slit your mother and your brother throat just to buy your way onto my lifeboat." I stood up from the cold wooden bench, looking down at the broken, shivering woman, clutching her wrinkled trench coat. "I do not negotiate with terrorists, Megan," I stated calmly. "And I certainly do not finance the legal defense of a federal criminal. Betrayal is a currency I no longer accept. You made your choices with Trevor. You built your fraudulent empire on vanity and lies. Now you get to face the federal prosecutors entirely on your own." I turned my back and began walking down the paved path, leaving my ruined coffee sitting on the bench next to her. I did not look over my shoulder, but I could feel the crushing, absolute weight of the realization crashing down on her. By offering to sell out Patricia and Justin, she had permanently severed any remaining ties to her mother and brother. By engaging in wire fraud, she had triggered her husband's ruthless betrayal. And by attempting to use that treason to buy my protection, she had just permanently alienated the only person on earth who possessed the power to save her. Megan sat alone on a freezing wooden bench in a public park, staring at a paper cup. She had no money. She had no husband. She had no family. She had no legal defense. The golden daughter of the tech world had isolated herself into an absolute suffocating vacuum, and there was absolutely no one left to catch her when she finally hit the ground. I did not need to place hidden surveillance cameras inside their new residence to know exactly how their first month of absolute poverty played out. When you strip away the luxury vehicles, the imported champagne, and the sprawling manicured estates from people who possess no internal moral compass, you are left with nothing but cornered feral animals. Human nature, especially the nature of greedy, desperate narcissists, is completely predictable. The implosion of their fragile alliance was a mathematical certainty. Justin was finally released from the downtown federal holding facility on a Tuesday afternoon. There was no aggressive, high-priced defense attorney walking him down the courthouse steps to address the media. There was no luxury town car waiting at the curb. He was represented by an exhausted public defender handling 70 other cases who had managed to secure a conditional release entirely because Justin was a first-time non-violent offender. Justin walked out of the heavy glass doors wearing the same wrinkled suit he had been arrested in days prior. He carried his personal effects in a clear plastic bag. Around his right ankle, tightly secured above his designer sock, was a heavy black global positioning monitor. He had to take a crowded city bus to the address Patricia had sent him through the public defender. He sat near the back of the loud, rattling vehicle, staring out the grease-stained window as the bus carried him further and further away from the wealthy commercial district he used to rule. The bus crossed into a blighted industrial neighborhood where the streetlights were broken and the sidewalks were littered with discarded trash. Justin stepped off at the corner, pulling the collar of his suit jacket up against the bitter wind. He walked up to a decaying brick apartment building. The security door was propped open with a broken cinder block. The hallway smelled heavily of boiled cabbage, damp carpet, and stale cigarette smoke. The elevator was out of order, forcing him to climb 4 flights of narrow, dimly lit stairs. His heavy breathing echoed in the miserable stairwell. He reached the 4th floor and knocked on a hollow wooden door covered in peeling brown paint. Patricia opened the door. The woman who had proudly stood at my retirement party boasting about her liberation looked entirely broken. She was wearing a designer silk blouse that was hopelessly wrinkled and stained with coffee. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and her face was pale and exhausted. She stepped aside without saying a word, allowing her golden child to enter the miserable sanctuary she had managed to secure with the absolute last of her scraped-together cash. The sublet was a suffocating, claustrophobic box. The ceiling hung low, featuring water stains that bloomed like dark bruises across the plaster. The living room contained a single, sagging thrift store sofa covered in faded floral fabric. Megan sat on that sofa, staring blankly at a shattered smartphone screen. She did not look up when her brother walked in. The golden daughter of the tech world was wearing dirty sweatpants, her fingernails bitten down to the quick, completely paralyzed by the terrifying reality of her looming federal indictment. There were only 2 small bedrooms. Patricia had claimed one for herself. Justin and Megan, 2 adults with massive inflated egos who despised sharing anything, were forced to occupy the other, sleeping on cheap twin mattresses shoved against peeling walls. The entire apartment vibrated every 10 minutes as the elevated train rattled past the single dirty window. The tension in that cramped, humid space was absolute poison. They were 3 people who had spent their entire lives deflecting responsibility and purchasing their way out of inconvenience. Now trapped together in a squalid box with no money and no escape routes, the polite masks of family solidarity completely disintegrated. The silence did not last through Justin's first evening. It started over something incredibly trivial: a missing carton of generic milk or a utility bill that had been slipped under the door. But the trivial spark instantly ignited the massive powder keg of their collective resentment. Justin slammed his fist onto the cheap laminate kitchen counter, shattering the fragile quiet. He turned on his mother with a vicious, unhinged fury, pointing a trembling finger directly at her face. He screamed that this entire nightmare was exclusively her fault. He yelled that if she had just kept her arrogant mouth shut and stayed married, they would all still be living in a 5-bedroom mansion. He blamed her vanity for initiating the divorce that triggered the forensic audit. He told her she was a foolish, greedy old woman who threw away a limitless fortune just to hear a room full of strangers clap for her. Patricia did not cower. She fired back with a shrill, terrifying shriek, slapping her hands against the counter. She screamed that Justin was a miserable, incompetent failure. She reminded him that she was not the one who forged federal commercial documents. She yelled that he had brought the Federal Bureau of Investigation directly to her doorstep with his illegal inventory loans. She blamed his pathetic need to look like a self-made entrepreneur for destroying the family name and freezing the capital she desperately needed to secure her own survival. Megan threw her shattered phone against the wall and joined the brawl, her voice cracking with raw, manic desperation. She screamed at both of them, calling them selfish, ignorant parasites. She wept that she was facing 20 years in a minimum security prison because their sloppy, loud greed had made the entire family a massive target. She blamed Patricia for creating the initial financial panic, and she blamed Justin for leaving a paper trail of obvious fraud. She screamed that Trevor had traded her to the federal government entirely because her mother and brother were too stupid to manage their crimes quietly. The screaming match lasted for hours, echoing through the thin walls of the miserable apartment building. The neighbors banged on the floorboards, demanding quiet, but the three of them could not stop. They tore into each other, tearing down the last remaining shreds of their familial loyalty. They weaponized every secret, every failure, and every bitter resentment they had harbored for decades. They stripped each other down to the bone, entirely annihilating the illusion that they had ever actually loved one another. Eventually, the exhaustion overtook the rage. The screaming faded into heavy, ragged breathing and quiet, pathetic sobbing. The tiny apartment grew suffocatingly silent. Justin sat on the stained linoleum floor, leaning his head back against the cheap kitchen cabinets. Patricia stood by the dirty window, staring out at the passing train, her shoulders slumped in total defeat. Megan curled into a tight ball on the sagging sofa, weeping into her hands. The anger was completely drained, leaving nothing but the cold, hard, terrifying reality of their situation. The rent for the miserable sublet was due in exactly 2 weeks, and they possessed a combined total of $47. Justin's public defender had called earlier, strongly urging him to accept a devastating plea deal because they had absolutely no capital to mount a trial defense. Megan was waiting to be formally arrested by the Securities and Exchange Commission with no legal representation whatsoever. Patricia was entirely unemployable, possessing no skills and a ruined reputation. They were sitting at the absolute bottom of a dark, inescapable well. They had no wealthy friends to call. They had no hidden assets to liquidate. They had no leverage to negotiate a surrender. As the cold reality settled over them, the three of them slowly looked at each other in the dim, flickering light of the apartment. A silent, bitter understanding passed between them. They had exhausted every alternative. They had played every card. They realized with absolute crushing certainty that there was only one remaining lifeline on the entire planet. There was only one man who held the corporate power, the financial capital, and the legal influence to halt their complete annihilation. They could not fight him. They could not outsmart him. They had to swallow every single ounce of their remaining pride. They had to go back to the man they had discarded, and they had to beg. Exactly 6 months had evaporated since the night my family stood in a mediocre banquet hall and celebrated my public execution. The bitter Chicago winter had thawed into a brilliant golden spring. I was sitting on the private, sun-drenched patio of the Oak Ridge Estate Country Club, an ultra-exclusive sanctuary hidden behind towering iron gates and centuries-old oak trees. This was a place where generational wealth whispered, where multi-million-dollar acquisitions were casually finalized over imported caviar and aged scotch. I sat alone at a pristine, white-clothed corner table overlooking the 18th hole, enjoying a rare cut of dry-aged steak and the profound, absolute silence of my unburdened life. Miles away from the manicured greens and the gentle clinking of crystal glasses, the three architects of their own destruction had finally hit absolute rock bottom. Patricia, Justin, and Megan had spent the last 2 weeks surviving in that suffocating, roach-infested sublet, tearing each other apart until there was nothing left to cannibalize. They had exhausted their public defenders, alienated their remaining acquaintances, and stared directly into the terrifying abyss of federal prison and permanent poverty. Desperation is a masterful teacher. It forcefully strips away the delusions of grandeur and replaces them with a primal, agonizing hunger for survival. They realized that their only path out of the grave they had dug was to crawl back to the man holding the shovel. They pooled the absolute last of their liquid capital. They gathered crumpled dollar bills, loose coins scrounged from the cushions of their sagging thrift store sofa, and whatever meager cash they could legally obtain to rent a vehicle. They did not secure a luxury import or a sleek black town car. They rented a dented 10-year-old economy sedan, that smelled of stale smoke and desperation. It was a vehicle that practically screamed financial ruin, a rolling monument to their spectacular downfall. They drove the sputtering car back toward the affluent suburbs they used to rule, navigating the familiar tree-lined streets with the terrifying realization that they were now entirely unwelcome outsiders. They could not simply drive through the main gates of the Oak Ridge Estate Country Club. Their rented economy car would have been instantly flagged and turned away by the armed security detail at the front entrance. But Patricia had spent 40 years studying the architecture of high society. She knew the invisible pathways used by the catering staff and the landscaping crews. She directed Justin to park the beaten vehicle behind a commercial strip mall a mile down the road. The three of them walked the remaining distance on foot, traversing the muddy wooded service trails, ruining their last presentable pairs of shoes. They slipped through an unlocked service gate near the delivery docks, trespassing onto the immaculate grounds, like desperate feral scavengers infiltrating a palace. They looked absolutely wretched. Patricia, who once refused to be seen without a fresh salon blowout and designer silk, was wearing a faded, oversized sweater, her face gaunt and stripped of its usual arrogant glow. Justin's tailored suits had been replaced by baggy, unironed slacks, his posture completely broken by the weight of his looming criminal trial. Megan looked like a ghost of her former self, shivering in the mild spring air, her eyes darting with the manic, exhausted paranoia of a woman facing federal wire fraud charges. They crept through the manicured hedges, scanning the outdoor dining patio until their eyes locked onto my table. I saw them approaching, before they even cleared the perimeter of the dining area. They looked entirely out of place among the wealthy executives and the quiet, relaxed atmosphere of the club. Their frantic, erratic energy disrupted the serene environment immediately. They did not walk with confidence. They practically stumbled toward my corner table, their faces twisted into masks of profound, rehearsed agony. Patricia reached the table first. She did not yell or demand attention. She collapsed against the edge of the white linen tablecloth, her hands gripping the edges so tightly, her knuckles turned bone white. The tears began to flow instantly, a torrential, sobbing performance designed to manipulate my deepest sympathies. "Douglas," she wept, her voice cracking loudly, drawing the irritated and confused stares of the wealthy patrons seated nearby. "Douglas, please, I am so sorry. I was out of my mind. I was sick with grief over getting older. I was terrified of losing my youth, and I let absolute confusion cloud my judgment. I did not mean any of it. I was surrounded by toxic friends who poisoned my mind against you. You have to believe me, I was suffering a complete mental breakdown. I need you. I cannot survive without you. Please, I am begging you to forgive a foolish, broken woman." Justin fell to his knees, directly onto the pristine stone patio. The golden child, the arrogant entrepreneur, who had forged my signature to fund his vanity, was openly weeping in front of the city's financial elite. "Dad, I am so sorry," he choked out, grasping at the hem of my tailored trousers. "I was drowning in debt. I was so desperate to make you proud, to show you I could be a successful businessman, that I lost my moral compass. I am facing 20 years in federal prison. They are going to lock me away. Please, Dad. Family is everything. You always taught us that family is everything. Do not let them take my life away." Megan stood behind them, her shoulders violently shaking as she sobbed into her hands. She did not offer excuses about her startup or blame her husband, Trevor. She completely surrendered. "Daddy, please," she cried, using the childhood moniker she had abandoned 2 decades ago. "I have absolutely no one left. I have nothing. I am so terrified. I made a catastrophic mistake, but I am still your little girl. Please give us a second chance. We will do anything. We will follow any rule you set. Just please bring us home." The disruption on this patio was absolute. The quiet murmurs of the wealthy patrons had completely ceased. Everyone was staring at the pathetic weeping trio huddled around my table. The country club manager, a stern man in a flawless suit, rushed out through the glass doors flanked by 3 muscular security guards. He looked absolutely horrified that the peace of his exclusive establishment had been violated by these weeping, disheveled trespassers. "Mr. Barrett," the manager said, his voice tight with professional panic, "I am so incredibly sorry for this intrusion. We will have these individuals physically removed from the premises immediately. I am calling the local authorities to press trespassing charges on your behalf." The security guards stepped forward, reaching out to grab Justin by the shoulders and haul him off the stone patio. Patricia shrieked, burying her face into her hands, anticipating the final brutal humiliation of being dragged away in handcuffs. Megan squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for the end. I raised my right hand, lifting a single finger. The gesture was entirely silent, but the authority behind it was absolute. The security guards froze in their tracks. The country club manager stepped back, waiting for my command. I looked down at the three weeping, broken people groveling at my feet. I observed their pathetic, desperate tears, their ruined clothes, and their completely shattered egos. They had executed a hostile takeover of my life 6 months ago, and now they were begging the man they tried to execute for a pardon. "Stand down," I said quietly to the manager. "Do not call the police. I know these people." Patricia gasped, lifting her tear-stained face. A massive, overwhelming wave of relief washed over her features. Justin let out a choked, ragged sigh, his shoulders slumping, as he genuinely believed he had just been granted a miracle. Megan opened her eyes, a tiny, desperate spark of hope igniting in her chest. They thought it had worked. They truly believed that my lingering paternal affection had overridden my cold, mathematical logic. They assumed their theatrical display of weeping and groveling had successfully manipulated the old, reliable safety net into catching them one final time. "Bring 3 chairs," I instructed the manager, my voice perfectly level. The manager, though clearly confused by my decision to entertain these trespassers, immediately signaled the staff. 3 heavy wooden chairs were quickly brought over and placed around the table. I gestured for Patricia, Justin, and Megan to sit. They scrambled off the stone patio, wiping their eyes and murmuring pathetic, endless strings of gratitude. They sat on the edge of the luxurious chairs, holding their breath, waiting for me to pull out my checkbook, call my corporate attorneys, and magically erase the catastrophic consequences of their actions. The manager hovered nearby, asking if there was anything else he could do to smooth over the disruption. I looked at him, and then I looked at the 3 desperate faces staring at me with hungry, hopeful eyes. "Yes," I replied, maintaining a deadpan, chilling calm. "Bring 3 glasses of champagne, but do not bring the vintage stock. Go to the catering kitchen and find the absolute cheapest, lowest-tier sparkling wine you keep for the budget events. The kind you serve in plastic cups. Bring it immediately." The waiter returned a moment later, carrying a heavy silver tray. The service at the Oak Ridge Estate Country Club was typically flawless, characterized by crystal flutes and imported linens. Today, the waiter followed my exact unconventional instructions without a single flicker of judgment. He placed 3 flimsy, translucent plastic cups on the immaculate white tablecloth in front of my family. He poured a pale, lukewarm, bottom-tier sparkling wine into each cup, the carbonation fizzling weakly. It was the exact same cheap beverage they had served at my retirement ambush. They did not question the insult. They were too completely consumed by the intoxicating delusion that they had successfully manipulated me. Patricia reached out with trembling hands and gripped the cheap plastic cup. She took a desperate gulp, closing her eyes, as if the foul liquid was the elixir of life. Justin and Megan followed suit, drinking eagerly, practically panting with relief. They believed this pathetic toast was the official reinstatement of their limitless funding. The sheer audacity of their greed materialized almost instantly. The tears of remorse dried up the second they thought my wallet was open. Patricia leaned forward, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial, urgent whisper. She bypassed any further apologies and immediately began outlining her survival strategy. She informed me that she needed an emergency cash wire to hire a high-powered bankruptcy attorney to fend off the bank's repossession agents. She casually mentioned that a luxury high-rise condominium downtown was currently accepting discreet cash offers, and it would be the perfect place for her to recover from the emotional trauma of the past 6 months. Justin interrupted his mother, completely blind to the offensive nature of their demands. He leaned his elbows on the table, his eyes wide and frantic. He told me that his public defender was useless. He demanded I retain the top federal criminal defense firm in the state. He wanted me to leverage my corporate logistics contacts to quietly negotiate a non-prosecution agreement with the federal authorities. He insisted that if I simply paid restitution to the commercial banks, he defrauded the entire felony indictment would magically vanish. Megan did not wait for her brother to finish. She practically shoved him aside, weeping anew, but this time with aggressive entitlement. She demanded that I completely eradicate her husband Trevor in federal court. She wanted me to deploy my corporate lawyers to bury his immunity deal. She then requested a massive capital injection to quietly settle the Securities and Exchange Commission fines, completely convinced that my money could resurrect her fraudulent tech startup and restore her ruined social reputation. I sat perfectly still. I did not interrupt them. I did not raise my hand or roll my eyes. I simply listened as they mentally spent millions of dollars I had no intention of giving them. They were utterly incapable of genuine repentance. They had learned nothing from their poverty, their isolation, or their impending incarcerations. They viewed my forgiveness as a financial transaction, assuming my paternal duty required me to absorb the catastrophic consequences of their profound moral failures. I took my time. I picked up my steak knife and cut a final, precise piece of dry, aged beef. I chewed it slowly, savoring the rich flavor, while their frantic demands washed over me like useless, empty noise. I placed my silverware down perfectly parallel on the porcelain plate. I picked up my linen napkin, blotted the corners of my mouth, and folded it neatly next to my glass of sparkling water. The absolute, terrifying quiet of my demeanor finally began to register. Patricia stopped talking mid-sentence. Justin's frantic hand gestures froze in the air. Megan swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously between my face and my folded hands. The warm spring breeze blew across the patio, but the temperature at our table plummeted into freezing, suffocating dread. They finally realized I was not pulling out a checkbook. I reached slowly into the tailored inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. I did not retrieve a gold-plated pen or a leather wallet. I pulled out my smartphone. I placed the device flat on the center of the white tablecloth, directly between their 3 plastic cups of cheap champagne. I tapped the screen once to unlock it. I opened an audio file I had kept saved on my home screen for exactly 6 months. I turned the volume to the maximum setting. I pressed play. The audio was pristine. It had been captured by a high-definition microphone I wore in my lapel on the night of my retirement. The quiet atmosphere of the country club patio was suddenly pierced by Patricia's amplified, venomous voice echoing from the small speaker. I am done playing the dutiful, supportive wife to a stingy, boring old man. I have spent my best years suffocating in a marriage devoid of passion or generosity. Tonight is not just your retirement, Douglas. It is my liberation. The recording captured the exact moment the room gasped in shock. But more importantly, it captured what followed. The audio file blasted the unmistakable sharp sound of a chair scraping backward. Then came the applause. It was loud, enthusiastic, and cruel. Justin's piercing 2-finger whistle shrieked from the phone speaker, followed immediately by Megan's drunken, elated cheering. The sound of my own children roaring with absolute joy at my public humiliation played on a continuous, inescapable loop. Several wealthy patrons at the adjacent tables stopped eating and turned to stare at our table, their expressions twisting in disgust as they listened to the venomous recording. The color drained completely from Patricia's face, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly gray. The plastic cup trembled violently in her hand, the cheap champagne sloshing over the rim and staining the pristine white tablecloth. Justin's mouth hung open, his breathing halting entirely as the ghost of his own cruel whistle mocked him from the device. Megan squeezed her eyes shut and clamped her hands over her ears, physically recoiling, as if the sound of her own cheering was burning her alive. I let the recording play to the very end. The final sound was the clatter of my car keys dropping into Patricia's empty glass. Then the audio cut off, leaving a ringing, devastating silence in its wake. I locked my phone and slid it back into my breast pocket. I leaned forward, bridging the physical distance between us. I looked at the three shattered, terrified people sitting across from me. My voice contained no anger, no sorrow, and no pity. It was a cold, mathematical verdict. You came here today, believing that crocodile tears could erase your treason, I stated quietly, my words slicing through their panic like a scalpel. You believed that begging would grant you access to the empire you tried to steal, but you fundamentally misunderstood the nature of this meeting. I did not invite you to sit down to negotiate your salvation. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but her throat was completely dry. No words came out, only a pathetic, choked gasp. You applauded my destruction. I continued my gaze, locking onto each of them in turn, ensuring the absolute finality of my words crushed whatever microscopic sliver of hope they had left. I am simply applauding your consequences. They sat frozen, paralyzed by the sheer insurmountable wall of my indifference. They finally understood that the safety net was not just removed, it had been incinerated. I reached down to the heavy leather briefcase resting against the leg of my chair. I unlatched the brass buckles. I reached inside and withdrew 3 thick, distinct items. I brought my hands up and placed them flat on the center of the table. They were 3 large, heavy manila envelopes. They were identical in size, shape, and weight to the exact envelope Patricia had shoved into my chest at the banquet hall 6 months ago. I placed my hand flat on top of the stack. With a slow, deliberate motion, I slid the first envelope across the smooth linen directly in front of Patricia. I slid the second envelope to Justin. I pushed the third envelope into Megan's trembling hands. I sat back in my chair, watching them stare at the heavy brown packages with absolute, unadulterated terror, waiting for them to open the final chapter of their ruin. The heavy brown paper of the manila envelopes rested on the pristine white tablecloth. The warm spring breeze blew across the country club patio, gently ruffling the corners of the envelopes. Patricia stared at the package in front of her. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. For a fleeting, desperate moment, the sheer gravity of her delusion completely took over. She wiped a tear from her cheek and managed a trembling, pathetic smile. She genuinely believed that inside this envelope was her salvation. She expected a certified cashier check. She anticipated a generous settlement agreement, a deed to a modest condominium, or perhaps a modest monthly allowance drawn from my corporate accounts. She thought I was finally offering her the golden parachute she felt she deserved. Justin and Megan looked at their own envelopes with the exact same starving anticipation. Justin wiped his sweaty palms on his wrinkled slacks. He was calculating how quickly he could deposit a check to hire a private criminal defense attorney and avoid the federal penitentiary. He assumed I was handing him a legal retainer to make his felony wire fraud charges disappear. Megan leaned forward, her eyes wide and hungry. She undoubtedly believed her envelope contained a binding non-prosecution agreement, neutralizing her treacherous husband Trevor and providing her with the seed capital to restart her fraudulent technology company. "Go ahead," I said, my voice soft and perfectly even. "Open them." Patricia reached out with shaking fingers. She grabbed the tab of the envelope and tore it open. The sound of tearing paper was incredibly loud in the suffocating quiet of the patio. She reached inside, expecting to feel the crisp, thick parchment of a legal settlement or the smooth surface of a bank draft. Instead, her fingers closed around a thick, stapled packet of standard printer paper. She pulled the packet out and laid it flat on the table. She stared at the front page. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly white. Her eyes darted back and forth across the black text, struggling to comprehend the words printed at the top of the page. It was not a settlement offer. It was not a bank draft. It was an official employment application. Printed clearly across the top of the page was the corporate logo of my national logistics firm. Directly beneath the logo, in bold, uncompromising capital letters, was the job title: Facility Maintenance and Sanitation Technician Night Shift. Patricia's mouth fell open. She blinked rapidly, trying to force the words to change into something else. She flipped to the second page of the packet. It outlined the mandatory duties of the position: scrubbing the concrete floors of the commercial loading docks, emptying the industrial trash compactors, cleaning the warehouse employee restrooms, operating the heavy machinery required to polish the concrete aisles. The designated hours were listed as 11 at night to 7 in the morning. The compensation was clearly printed at the absolute legal minimum wage. Justin desperately ripped his envelope open, tearing the brown paper in half. He pulled out his packet and stared at the exact same corporate logo. The former luxury car dealer, the man who used to mock my conservative business strategies and wear imported Italian silk suits, was staring at an application for a commercial janitor. He flipped through the pages reading the strict corporate policies regarding mandatory steel-toed boots, random drug testing, and a zero-tolerance policy for unexcused absences. His breathing became ragged and shallow as the reality of his total humiliation set in. Megan slowly pulled her packet from the envelope. The golden daughter of the tech world, the woman who had graced the covers of local business magazines, was holding a document that required her to list her previous manual labor experience. She stared at the section detailing the uniform requirements. 2 pairs of navy blue industrial coveralls provided by the company, the cost of which would be deducted from her first minimum wage paycheck. "What is this?" Patricia whispered, her voice cracking and fading into a pathetic croak. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Douglas, I do not understand. What are these papers?" I remained seated, observing the complete collapse of their manufactured superiority. They had spent their entire lives treating working-class people like invisible, disposable commodities. They had built their fragile identities entirely on the illusion of inherited prestige and unearned luxury. Now they were holding the absolute baseline of manual survival in their manicured, trembling hands. "I told you I was applauding your consequences," I said, keeping my tone perfectly detached. "You came here begging for my money. You wept and pleaded for a second chance. You told me you would do absolutely anything to survive. I am offering you the chance to prove it." Justin dropped the application onto the table as if the paper were burning his fingers. "Dad, you cannot be serious." He choked out, his voice shaking with panic. "I am facing a federal indictment. I need a massive legal retainer. I cannot mop warehouse floors in the middle of the night. I am an entrepreneur." "You are an unemployed federal suspect facing decades in a penitentiary," I corrected him sharply, shutting down his delusion instantly. "You forged my signature to fund your vanity. You gambled away your dealership. You possess absolutely no marketable skills, and your reputation is entirely destroyed. The only reason my human resources department will even consider your application is because I am the majority shareholder." Megan began to cry again, but these were not tears of manipulation. These were tears of absolute suffocating despair. "Daddy, please," she sobbed, clutching the application to her chest. "I cannot do manual labor. I have a master's degree. I was a chief executive officer. Trevor ruined my life. You cannot make me clean toilets. I will be a laughingstock." "You ruined your own life, Megan," I replied without a single ounce of sympathy. "You fabricated your corporate revenue. You stole from my emergency medical accounts to backpack across Europe. You laughed and cheered when your mother handed me divorce papers at my retirement party. You thought you were invincible. Now you get to learn the true value of a single dollar earned through grueling, honest sweat." Patricia slammed her hands flat against the table, causing the cheap plastic cups of champagne to rattle. "You are a monster," she hissed, her face twisting with bitter, venomous rage. "We are your family. You are a millionaire. You have endless resources. You are trying to humiliate us for your own sick amusement. I will not sign this degrading garbage. I would rather live on the streets than scrub your warehouse floors." I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up, towering over the 3 of them. I looked down at the ruined woman who had tried to steal my estate, the son who had tried to steal my credit, and the daughter who had tried to sell them all out for a bribe. I believe in hard work, I said, my voice carrying across the quiet country club patio, absolute and unyielding. I built my empire by working 80-hour weeks while you slept in silk sheets. I absorbed every financial blow you created so you could pretend you were royalty. That free ride ended the night you publicly humiliated me. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a $50 bill, and dropped it onto the table to cover the cost of their cheap, sparkling wine. If you want my money, you will mop my floors for minimum wage, I stated with absolute finality. You will clock in at 11 at night. You will clean the loading docks. You will scrub the employee restrooms. You will earn every single penny you desperately need. If you want a lifeline, read the terms and sign at the bottom. I turned my back on them and walked away. I did not look over my shoulder. I walked through the glass doors of the country club, leaving them sitting outside in the mild spring breeze. They did not chase after me. They did not scream or throw their cups. They were completely paralyzed. Patricia, Justin, and Megan sat frozen at the pristine white table surrounded by wealthy patrons enjoying their luxurious lunches. They stared down at the thick packets of standard printer paper, realizing the absolute, irreversible destruction of their egos. The safety net had not just been removed. It had been replaced with a mop and a bucket. The golden family of the Chicago suburbs was entirely annihilated, left to choose between actual starvation or the ultimate grueling humiliation of honest manual labor. Hunger is the ultimate and uncompromising negotiator. Pride is a luxury that requires a heavily funded bank account, and my former family no longer possessed a single drop of either. Within 48 hours of that quiet afternoon on the country club patio, 3 signed employment applications were silently slid under the glass partition of my corporate human resources department. They had desperately tried to find other avenues first. They had undoubtedly applied to comfortable desk jobs, retail management positions, and anything that would allow them to maintain a microscopic shred of their former dignity. But the professional market is entirely unforgiving to a disgraced socialite, a federally indicted fraudster, and a ruined tech executive with pending charges from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Their background checks were completely radioactive. Corporate doors slammed in their faces before they could even step through the frames. Out of options and staring down the barrel of absolute starvation, they surrendered to the absolute bottom line of their survival. I never visited the regional logistics center during the night shift, but the facility manager sent me regular and highly objective reports. Patricia, the woman who once spent $10,000 on a single handbag to impress country club women who secretly despised her, now wears a faded navy blue industrial uniform. Her nights are spent pushing a heavy waterlogged mop across miles of unforgiving frozen concrete. Her manicured hands, once soft and adorned with diamonds purchased with my stolen equity, are now calloused, cracked, and permanently stained with industrial degreaser. She scrubs the warehouse bathrooms, emptying overflowing trash bins, while truck drivers and forklift operators walk past her completely blind to the aristocratic delusions she still clings to in her own mind. She finishes her shift at 7 in the morning, stepping out into the harsh daylight with an aching spine and the crushing realization that she has to do it all over again the next night just to afford her squalid apartment. Justin, the golden boy, who leased European sports cars to project an aura of effortless entrepreneurial brilliance, now spends his nights hauling crushed cardboard and sweeping the loading docks. He wears heavy steel-toed boots that blister his feet. He takes his government-mandated 15-minute breaks, sitting on a plastic crate in a freezing alley behind the warehouse, rubbing his aching lower back and staring blankly at the brick wall. The federal courts allowed him to remain out of prison on a highly restrictive probation, strictly because he secured legitimate documented employment. He is entirely trapped. He cannot quit his janitorial position, or he immediately violates his parole and goes straight to a federal cell. He is forced to sweep the dirt from the tires of the very delivery trucks that fund the empire he foolishly threw away. Every sweeping motion is a reminder of the massive fortune he forfeited for the sake of his own vanity. Megan works 3 aisles down from her brother. The visionary chief executive officer who gave arrogant keynote speeches about disrupting the technology sector now manually scrapes chewing gum and crushed debris off the warehouse floor. She is strictly forbidden from touching any computers or administrative paperwork due to the severe parameters of her ongoing federal wire fraud investigations. Her entire world has shrunk to the exact dimensions of a yellow janitorial supply cart. They do not speak to each other during their shifts. The toxic, fragile alliance they once shared has completely dissolved into silent, mutual resentment. They work in the same echoing facility surrounded by the deafening roar of conveyor belts and diesel engines, completely isolated in their own private purgatories. Every single time they look down at the corporate logo stitched over their own hearts, they are violently reminded of the limitless wealth they willingly slaughtered. While they scrubbed the floors of my industrial empire, I was busy dismantling the final monument to their greed. The massive, sprawling 5-bedroom house in the Chicago suburbs, the estate Patricia had mortgaged to the hilt to fund her gambling addiction, was completely cleared of its toxic debts. I utilized a fraction of my corporate dividends to satisfy the lending bank not to reclaim the house for myself, but to permanently alter its purpose. I formally transferred the deed to a highly respected national charity that provides transitional housing and educational support for at-risk young adults. The formal dining room where Patricia used to host her arrogant, superficial brunches was converted into a communal study hall. The master suite, with its massive walk-in closets that once housed stolen designer fashion, was remodeled into safe, comfortable living quarters for teenagers who actually need a second chance at life. The grand foyer no longer echoes with the hollow fake laughter of country club socialites. It rings with the genuine, hopeful voices of young people building real futures through honest, dedicated effort. I eradicated the toxic legacy of that property and replaced it with an engine of actual human growth. The neighborhood association originally complained about the charity, but my corporate lawyers swiftly buried their objections, leaving the shelter to thrive exactly where Patricia once reigned. I did not need a mansion to prove my worth. I purchased a modest, beautifully crafted cedar home resting quietly on the edge of a pristine, isolated lake in the northern woods. It is a place completely disconnected from the frantic, superficial noise of the city. The air up here smells of pine needles and fresh water, clean and entirely unburdened. There are no grand, sweeping staircases. There are no marble countertops imported from Italy. There is just solid wood, massive glass windows letting in the natural light, and a profound, unbreakable tranquility. I wake up every morning without the heavy, suffocating knot of anxiety in my chest. I no longer check my bank accounts waiting for a fraudulent withdrawal. I no longer walk on eggshells in my own hallways. I am not alone in this new chapter. For decades, I was surrounded by a family that viewed my existence as a transactional obligation. Now the people who sit on my wooden deck are genuine. They are old friends from my early days in the logistics industry, neighbors who judge a man by his character rather than his stock portfolio, and colleagues who stood by me when building the company required grueling, sleepless nights. We do not talk about high society gossip or scheme for status. We host barbecues on the weekends, sharing good food and authentic laughter. We talk about the changing seasons, the history of the lake, and the simple, profound joy of living a quiet, honest life. The warmth of these friendships starkly highlights the absolute coldness of the family I left behind. I sit in a heavy wooden Adirondack chair on my back deck, a cool autumn breeze brushing across my face. I hold a simple ceramic mug filled with strong, bitter black coffee. The sun is beginning its slow descent over the distant tree line, casting long, brilliant streaks of gold and deep purple across the glassy surface of the lake. The water is perfectly still, reflecting the vibrant colors of the sky with flawless clarity. A lone loon calls out in the distance, a peaceful, echoing sound that perfectly matches the quiet rhythm of my new life. There is no shouting. There are no frantic phone calls demanding emergency wire transfers to fix a manufactured crisis. There are no theatrical displays of disrespect or calculated ambushes waiting for me in the dark. The heavy, suffocating parasite of their endless greed has been entirely severed. I look out at the horizon, watching the daylight slowly fade, and I feel a profound, absolute stillness in my chest. They believed that power required a microphone, an audience, and a cruel, spectacular display of dominance. They thought victory belonged to the loudest voice in the room and the most vicious insult. They genuinely believed that by ambushing me at my retirement party, they had permanently established their superiority. They were catastrophically wrong. True power does not scream. True power does not need to throw a tantrum, demand immediate compliance, or perform for a crowd. True power simply walks away systematically, removes the safety net, and quietly watches gravity do its perfect, uncompromising work.